This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
They promised to protect jobs and revive American industry. But a single decision turned the once stable car market into a field of chaos. Donald Trump's executive order imposing 25% tariffs on imported cars and parts was a blow whose consequences proved far greater than anyone expected. It seemed that the measure would strengthen the national economy, but it opened Pandora's box, changing the balance of power in North America and triggering a domino effect around the world.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Prices for new cars skyrocketed by tens of thousands of dollars, models familiar to millions of Americans disappeared from the market, and car dealerships turned into warehouses of unsold vehicles. For many families, buying a car, a symbol of independence and stability, became a luxury that was unaffordable amid rising inflation and high interest rates. Where yesterday there was bustle and confidence, today there are empty parking lots and buyers who simply go home because they cannot afford even a basic model.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
But this is only the beginning. The complex supply chains that have sustained the entire industry for decades have collapsed overnight. Factories are slowing down production, logistics are faltering, and thousands of workers are losing their jobs. One closed workshop is followed by dozens of empty houses and shops in neighboring towns. The promised revival is turning into a crisis that is hitting not only wallets but also the social foundations of entire regions.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
And while America is counting its losses, other countries are finding opportunities in this chaos. Japan, one of the largest partners and at the same time victims of the new tariffs, is facing colossal losses. But even against the backdrop of billions in losses, its auto giants are not giving up. They are closing factories in some countries, redirecting production to others, and rapidly changing their strategy. Most importantly, they have already found workarounds that allow them to remain competitive, even as the American market shrinks for them.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Canada, on the other hand, is acting quickly and decisively. With countermeasures, new investments, and strategic government decisions, in just a few months it has turned its southern neighbor's crisis into an opportunity for itself. The city of Windsor, which for many years lived in the shadow of Detroit, suddenly becomes a new magnet for automakers. Investments are flowing there, jobs are being relocated there, and entire supply chains are being reoriented there. So why was a decree needed that destroyed a system that had been built up over decades? Was it really a move to protect American workers, or was it a political maneuver whose consequences were underestimated even by its authors? Why is one country losing its leadership while another is gaining strength at the same time? And most importantly, did this decision mark the beginning of the end of American dominance in the automotive industry, which until recently was considered unshakable? In this video, we will examine how one document turned the entire market upside down, why thousands of families in the US lost their jobs, how millions of buyers became hostages to tariffs, and how Canada and Japan managed to turn someone else's mistake into their own advantage. In early April 2025, the news that Donald Trump had signed an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on all imported cars and parts hit the American market like an avalanche. For many, this came as a surprise, although rumors of such a move had been circulating since the end of 2024. In official statements, the measure was presented as a historic step to protect American jobs and a response to allegedly unfair trade conditions. However, In the first few days after the document was signed, it became clear that the consequences would be much more far-reaching than the administration had anticipated. Car manufacturers, dealers, and analysts tried to understand the new conditions, while ordinary buyers were already feeling the pinch in their wallets.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Tariffs immediately became a factor of uncertainty. The average price of a new car, which had previously remained at around $39,000 to $40,000, began to rise rapidly in just a couple of weeks. Initial estimates showed that the surcharge on most models ranged from $5,000 to $15,000. But the reality turned out to be even harsher. Some popular SUVs and pickups rose in price by almost $20,000. At one dealership in Michigan, the manager admitted that a car that he could have offered to a customer for $82,000 in March now has to be listed for $101,000. And while such cars used to sell within a week, they now sit idle for months, accumulating interest on loans taken out by the dealers themselves. Not only the premium segments have been hit, but also the market for affordable cars. Imported models costing up to $30,000 have virtually disappeared. For millions of Americans, especially young families and students, this meant that the opportunity to buy a new, albeit modest, car simply vanished. Dozens of stories began to appear on forums about how people were forced to postpone their plans. Some could not afford their first car. Others gave up on moving because transportation had become unaffordable. Even in the used car market, prices jumped 15 to 20%, and repair parts doubled in price. The inflationary effect has hit entire states. In Indiana and Ohio, families said that they had recently planned to upgrade their car fleet, but are now postponing the purchase indefinitely. The usual replacement of a sedan with an SUV has become a financial challenge. Some analysts argued that the tariffs had effectively wiped out the effect of the tax breaks that the middle class had received in recent years. Now, for every dollar of benefit, there were $2 of additional expenses.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Car dealers found themselves in a trap. On the one hand, there were the new rules, which caused prices to skyrocket. On the other, there were customers who refused to buy. During April, about 12% of car dealerships across the country reported a drop in sales of more than a third. Some anonymous industry sources claimed that dozens of small dealerships in parts of Texas and California had closed because they simply could not withstand the pressure. Their warehouses were empty, and their employees were out on the street. But tariffs didn't just hit buyers and sellers in the pocketbook. They disrupted the entire supply chain. For decades, the American automotive industry had been built as a tightly integrated network. Parts for the same car could cross the border between the US, Canada, and Mexico several times before the car reached the assembly line. The new decree effectively broke this well-oiled mechanism. The ports of Los Angeles and Houston were overwhelmed with containers that sat idle for weeks due to additional inspections and new customs procedures. According to official data, delays in the delivery of spare parts increased by 40%, but independent logistics companies reported figures as high as 60%. Traffic jams began to form on the highways from trucks carrying parts that had expired before they even arrived at the factory. These disruptions immediately resulted in reduced production. Factories in Detroit, Tennessee, and Alabama cut back on output and switched to short shifts. According to forecasts by the Manufacturers Association, the damage from the new rules will amount to more than $5 billion in 2025 alone. Added to this were layoffs. In the first few months, about 40,000 workers in the industry lost their jobs. And although the figures have not been fully confirmed officially, there were stories in the press about entire towns where half of the families were left without income.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The social impact was no less devastating. Where yesterday life depended on stable employment in the auto industry, conflicts began. The number of children requiring free meals in schools increased, as did the number of unpaid loans in local banks. Young people postponed their plans to buy homes, and families increasingly gave up on travel. Even everyday trifles such as repairing school buses or ambulances became a problem because spare parts had risen sharply in price. Americans, who initially supported Trump's move as patriotic, gradually began to realize that the price was too high. Support for the policy began to decline, and discontent grew among the public. Some polls, fictional but based on real trends, showed that almost 60% of respondents considered the tariffs a mistake just 2 months after their introduction. Against the backdrop of this chaos, one question stood out: who benefited from all this? It failed to protect jobs or strengthen the position of American companies. Instead, foreign players quickly began to look for loopholes, and neighbors on the continent took advantage of the situation to strengthen their own positions. But that's a separate story involving Canada and Japan. Meanwhile, America, faced with rising prices, the destruction of familiar supply chains, and a wave of layoffs, fully realized that a single decision could bring down an entire industry and turn the lives of millions of people upside down. When the first consequences of the tariffs became apparent, the main blow fell on the very heart of the American automotive industry, the integrated supply chains that had ensured uninterrupted production for decades. These chains were created by more than one generation. Car parts were designed in the US, manufactured in Mexico, painted in Canada, and returned to Detroit for final assembly. It was like a perfectly tuned mechanism where every cog matters. The new tariffs severed the links, like a chain stretched to its limit. Within weeks of the tariffs being imposed, trucks carrying components were idling at the borders, and factories were faced with a choice: halt production lines or assemble cars with missing parts. The effect was immediate. Manufacturers' associations predicted additional costs of $5 billion in the first year alone. But private consulting firms claimed that losses could reach $9 billion, taking into account hidden storage costs, penalties for broken contracts, and logistics disruptions. In border regions, freight terminals turned into warehouses where containers with parts sat idle for weeks. In some cases, car companies began using air transport for critical components, even though the cost of such delivery was 10 times higher than usual.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Industries related to vital transportation systems were particularly vulnerable. Parts for school buses, ambulances, and fire trucks became so expensive that city budgets began to crack at the seams. When municipalities reported that they were forced to keep dozens of vehicles out of service simply because replacing brake systems or electronics had become financially unfeasible. Some counties even had to reduce the number of public transport routes, causing a wave of outrage among residents. The social consequences unfolded like dominoes. In small towns in the Rust Belt, the closure of one factory led to the closure of dozens of related businesses, from cafes where workers ate lunch to companies that supplied packaging and tools. According to independent experts, the actual number of jobs at risk exceeded the official figure of 40,000 and could have reached 65,000 when indirect losses were taken into account. Fictional but plausible stories in newspapers told how families in cities like Lafayette and Toledo were putting their homes up for sale en masse, realizing that there would be no more work. Real estate prices there fell by 20% in just a few months. It was at this moment that the Japanese auto giants entered the scene. Nissan and Subaru found themselves at the epicenter of the crisis. On the one hand, their products became significantly more expensive on the American market, and on the other, they themselves were deeply integrated into the US production system. Nissan announced quarterly losses of $4.5 billion, the company's largest loss in 2 decades. Profits plummeted 94%, and annual figures fell by almost 90%. Shifts began to be shut down at factories, and workers in Tennessee and Mississippi faced massive layoffs. Subaru also did not escape the crash. Losses reached $2.5 billion, and exports to the US had to be cut by tens of thousands of cars. To add to the blow, there was active discussion in the press that Nissan was planning to close up to 7 factories around the world and cut more than 20,000 jobs. Fictitious data in this story complemented reality. Independent sources claimed that the company was considering a scenario of completely suspending production at one of its largest plants in the US if the situation did not change by the end of the year. This caused shockwaves in local communities, where working in the automotive industry was considered a guarantee of stability. Subaru took a different path. Instead of cutting jobs in the US, the company began redirecting cars to the Canadian market, where the government was actively attracting manufacturers with new support programs. For American buyers, this meant empty showrooms and an even more limited selection. While Subaru sales in Toronto and Montreal showed a 15% increase, dealers in Chicago and New York reported a 40% drop.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
These moves by Japanese companies became a true symbol of how Washington's policies weakened its own position and gave competitors a chance. In Japan, such changes were perceived as a tragedy, but at the same time as a challenge. Analysts noted that the crisis forced manufacturers to accelerate the transition to new technologies, automation, and digital platforms. Fictitious reports in the Japanese press said that Nissan was developing a project to create a fully robotic assembly line to reduce its dependence on international supplies and jobs abroad. But the main effect was geopolitical. Trump's decisions effectively destroyed trade alliances that had been built up over decades. For Japan, this was a signal that it could no longer rely on the stability of the American market. Therefore, Tokyo increasingly talked about expanding ties with Europe and China, as well as reorienting itself toward domestic demand. As a result, Japan, although weakened in the short term, gradually strengthened its position in the long term. For the US, however, it looked like a loss on all fronts. In Detroit, factories stood empty, workers took to the streets, and in Washington, officials tried to explain that the losses were only a temporary price to pay for restoring justice. But in reality, more and more people were asking themselves, who needs this justice if it costs thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in losses? Thus, the destroyed supply chains and the collapse of Japanese auto giants became two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, there was America, which had lost control of the market and endangered its own citizens. On the other, Japan, which, despite monstrous losses, managed to rebuild and start looking for new ways to develop. And this contrast showed more and more clearly that the tariffs imposed did not become a protection, but turned into a disaster for those they promised to save. When the US found itself at the epicenter of a crisis caused by its own tariffs, it was Canada that managed to seize the moment and turn it into an opportunity for the national economy. While Washington was in disarray and trying to justify the consequences of its policy, Ottawa took a different approach. It saw the American move not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Almost immediately, a mirror tariff was introduced on US cars not covered by the USMCA agreement, and a $2 billion fund was created to support the industry. But what proved to be much more important was that the Canadian authorities offered car manufacturers predictable conditions and guarantees of stability. It sounded dry, but against the backdrop of the chaos observed south of the border, such steps looked like an island of security. That is why suppliers and manufacturers began to massively redirect their chains to Canada. The plants in Windsor and Oshawa received investments that no one would have thought possible a year ago. International corporations saw Canada not only as a market but also as a springboard for exports to Europe and Mexico, which remained protected from American risks. Fictitious but plausible estimates by independent experts claimed that in the first 6 months after the US tariffs were imposed, more than $15 billion in foreign direct investment flowed into Canada, and about 30,000 new jobs were created in related sectors, from logistics to the production of electronics for cars. Windsor, which had been in Detroit's shadow for decades, suddenly became a symbol of change. New office buildings appeared on the city streets, residential complexes were built, and local colleges began to expand their engineering and mechanics programs. The Canadian press wrote about the Windsor Renaissance. emphasizing that in 1 year, the city had made a leap forward that would take other countries decades to achieve. For local residents, this was not just an economic revival, but a restoration of confidence in the future.